Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 27th, 1844, Joseph Smith, the founder and leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormon Church, is murdered along with his brother Hiram when a mob breaks into a jail that they are being held in Carthage, Illinois. That is a notable event for sure, but what makes it especially notable, for this podcast at least, is that Smith was a presidential candidate at the time. Earlier that spring, he had announced that he was running as an independent, his first foray into formal politics. One interesting distinction is that Smith was the first presidential candidate to be killed in the United States. So, here to discuss the presidential candidacy and the death of Joseph Smith are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Spencer McBride, Associate Managing Historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He's written a number of books and articles about the intersection of Mormonism and politics. And guess what? He just published a book called Joseph Smith for President. So, Spencer, you're our guy. I'm confident to say.
I hope so. It's good to be with you guys.
So, since we are hooking it and talking a little bit about the death of Smith, I wonder if we can start there. And I will just start to sketch the picture and then you can actually paint it. But Smith and his followers had settled in the town of Nauvoo, Illinois, which is not too far from Carthage. There is a dispute among the community there. Smith is taken to jail. A mob comes after him. Again, that's a very rough sketch. Take us to that moment.
Yeah, so when the Mormons came to Illinois, they came as religious refugees. They had actually been expelled from the state of Missouri. And this is hard for us to hear even today, but a governor of a state ordered that the Mormons must be driven from the state or exterminated. And so there's this expulsion under the threat of state-sanctioned extermination. The Mormons are starting over as refugees on the banks of the Mississippi River, and they begin building a new city. And the goal is to protect themselves in the city, to have a local militia group, to have laws that would prevent further mob violence. And the state of Illinois at first welcomes them in. And this is a very political story in a sense, because the two dominant parties of the day, the Whigs and the Democrats, were very evenly divided in Illinois. And the thought of both, including Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, was if we win the Mormons to our side, they're going to tip the scale one way or the other. And so this is the very hospitable way the Mormons come into Illinois, but they continue to vote as a bloc. So the Mormons would vote together. And they weren't aligned with one party or the other. They were going to vote for the party, the candidates who would protect their rights. And this is how they wielded power as a political minority. And it was going okay until they became unpredictable and unreliable in that bloc vote. And if you're going to vote as a bloc, you need to vote consistently and predictably as a bloc. And when you can't be relied on in that way, it creates problems. And so it's after a congressional election in 1843 that a large segment of the Illinois population is they're done. And they are, from that point on, looking for any chance they can have to get rid of Joseph Smith and the Mormons, to get them out of the state. And that moment comes in June 1844.
So what is the dispute in Nauvoo that leads to Smith being arrested, and then who is the mob that comes to assassinate him? And you do use that word assassination, right?
Yeah. And we can alternately say murder. For practicing Latter-day Saints, they see it as a martyrdom. Mm-hmm. But martyr, murder, assassination, they're used interchangeably. So what happens in Illinois in June is some dissent, who Joseph Smith refers to as dissenters, members of the church who break away from the church. They're disenchanted with Joseph Smith, and they start a newspaper. They call it the Nauvoo Expositor. And essentially it's an anti-Mormon newspaper coming out of the center of Mormonism. And they print one issue, and Joseph Smith, as mayor of Nauvoo, then goes to the city council and, citing, Blackstone and English common law, deems the newspaper a public nuisance. And then by order of the city council, the newspaper is shut down, the press is destroyed, the governor gets involved, Joseph Smith declares martial law in the city of Nauvoo. Ultimately, Joseph Smith submits to arrest along with his brother Hiram and several other individuals implicated in the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor. But they are also charged with treason for declaring martial law. And this means they can't post bail, they cannot leave the prison. And it becomes really clear for most people that charge of treason was meant to keep Joseph and Hiram Smith in jail while everyone else could go. Because again, long before the destruction of this press, there were people in Illinois that were just waiting for the opportunity to get at Joseph Smith, and this provided it for them.
That's such a rich and detailed story, because it's in this very understandable, I think, story of religious persecution. That's something that we understand from the way that we talk about U.S. history. But then when you dig down into this kind of internecine war that's breaking out among the Mormons, and the way that anti-Mormons are able to leverage that tension in order to act out their anti-Mormon politics, it is just really fascinating.
Yeah, so critics of the Mormons see, right, these actions as anti-democratic. But the Mormons as a minority see it the only way we can survive in a democracy that refuses to protect us. And so there's this tension. Who's the anti-democratic group? Is it the anti-Mormons in Illinois, or is it the Mormons? And both see the perspective, they see themselves as protecting democracy. But really, sometimes when we're talking about protecting democracy, especially when one group has privilege and power, they're talking about protecting their authority in democracy. They're not really talking about protecting democracy. And so from the Mormons' perspective as a minority group, they're saying it's not really democracy if the minority has no rights.
So much about this moment just reminds me of the abolitionists, because they were had mob attacks, and this is really the decade of like mob attacks. The 20s, 30s, it's a height at the 30s, also the 40s as well, in which fringe groups like the abolitionists, like Mormons, are constantly being attacked. Or their printing presses are constantly being attacked. And I wonder how much of this violence that's happening is, how much do Mormons feel as though they can respond legitimately to the violence? You had mentioned that developing like militia groups, but like, what do you do when you don't have any protecting forces? The police is not going to work for them.
Yeah, and that's actually why Joseph Smith enters this presidential campaign. He sees as the fundamental problem the states' rights doctrines. Because when they are expelled from Missouri, they go to the White House and meet with President Martin Van Buren. They petition Congress. The Senate Judiciary Committee has a hearing and decides the federal government can do nothing. And Joseph Smith is saying there's something wrong with the Constitution. If one state can expel a minority group from its borders under threat of extermination, and the federal government says their hands are tied because of states' rights. And so Joseph Smith, that's his big argument. And he declares the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs.
He's not wrong.
Right, exactly. And he's on this vanguard of people calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states. And Joseph Smith, he's not a great political thinker. He's not this great constitutional scholar. His lived experience says there's something wrong when states' rights allows this persecution, this mob violence.
The other thing that I found so interesting about Smith in the context of this campaign is that he embraces policies that would have been considered radical at the time, and I think would be considered quite progressive today. The abolition of slavery being one of those, which flows into what Kellie was saying, but also things like the closure of prisons. I realize we didn't have a prison industrial complex in the 1840s, but that is a very different way of thinking about crime and punishment in the 1840s. And not everything that he embraced would be considered progressive today, but policy lines that I don't think that I would have necessarily expected.
Yeah, I think it surprises a lot of people, especially, 21st century America. The Latter-day Saints, not all, of course, but a large majority tend to be very reliable conservative voters. And here we have a very progressive and in some ways radical reform campaign coming from that church's founding prophet. He's calling for the paid emancipation of slaves, essentially that we will purchase the freedom of all enslaved men, women, and freedom from the proceeds of sales of Western land. So paid emancipation wasn't new, but at the scale and with government sponsorship that Joseph Smith was calling for, that was new, that was radical. Closing the prisons, penitentiaries were brand new. And it was this idea that we can reform convicted men and women, mostly men at this time, with solitary confinement and hard labor. And Joseph Smith's not the only one, but he's an early voice saying, hey, we're essentially creating a permanent criminal class. We're not reforming people. We're dooming them to a life of on the margins. But Kellie, there's actually this, you talked about abolitionists and these mobs in 1854. The way I closed the book is one of the Missouri militiamen that expelled the Mormons in 1854 as a sitting U.S. senator. And he writes to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis about what they're going to do about the abolitionists who are spilling into Missouri. And he says, we intend to burn, shoot, and hang them. In short, we plan to Mormonize them. And so all of a sudden, Mormonize becomes a verb for extra legal violence to expel, unwanted groups.
Wow. I stand by this. The idea that, the moment you take the side of the oppressed or Black people, you put yourself in a position to be harmed or killed. The strain of anti-Blackness, I think, is so strong that when people take up opposition to it, they almost always put themselves in harm's way. And the abolitionists were a perfect example of how people risk their lives to push these ideals.
I think we've painted an interesting picture of his motivations and a little bit of his platform. So he's a presidential candidate. There was a candidate, but I don't know if there was really a campaign. It doesn't seem like he's out there traveling around doing events. I think he even is quoted as saying, if it were up to me, I would really just stay in Illinois and sort of run my militia and protect my community. What is your sense of this as an actual campaign?
Yeah, so this is at that kind of pivotal moment where presidential electioneering is changing. It's still not acceptable for a candidate to go out and make stump speeches, but they send their surrogates, which they've always done, but now candidates are taking a more hands-on role with directing their surrogates. And Joseph Smith has an advantage in 1844 that most independent candidates don't have, is he has hundreds of experienced missionaries. Now, they're used to going out and preaching religion, but he actually sends over 400 missionaries to go out and campaign. He has his political pamphlet that lays out his platform, and they carry it almost as a political tract. And they have nominating conventions in almost every state. And these are kind of interesting stories. For instance, in Boston, Brigham Young, who would be Joseph Smith's successor, leads this political meeting. And there's all these hecklers. And the meeting can't go on because of the hecklers. The police are called. And then the meeting breaks down into chaos. The hecklers don't fight with the Mormons. The hecklers start a brawl with the police. And it's this almost quintessential 19th century Boston scene, right?
Sounds about right.
Maybe 20th century too.
Yeah, exactly. Not just 19th century.
Yeah. But then there's others that are taking this pamphlet that calls for the end of slavery to places like Tennessee, and they're facing potential mobs there, not because they're Mormon, but because it's illegal to distribute anti-slavery literature. And I don't think they recognized that was going to be a problem. They go to New York City and they establish a campaign newspaper right there on Printers Row in Manhattan. I mean, you want to talk about really esoteric political facts. Sam Brannan is the head of this newspaper. He takes, after all this stuff happens, he takes that printing press to California. And that same press prints news of gold being discovered in California in 1848. That's probably way even more esoteric than this show calls for.
No. You just gave everyone a book idea to follow one printing press across the United States and weave a narrative. That's a great one. I'm just curious how much of a direct line between Smith's candidacy and his assassination you can draw. I mean, or is it just that this was an incredibly fraught moment, and the assassination is a symbol of that, and the candidacy was also a product of that as well? Or are they somehow connected?
Yeah, so the asterisks in all of this, Joseph Smith is the first assassinated presidential candidate. He was not killed, as far as I can tell, to stop him from becoming president. Right. He was never a serious contender, and the people who killed him, if the presidential campaign concerned them, it would be they saw it as a sign of unfettered political ambition, right, which Joseph Smith saw it as an act of desperation. But the causes of the mob storming Carthage jail and killing Joseph Smith, they were local in nature. And so he is the first assassinated presidential candidate, but the asterisk is he was not assassinated because he was running for president.
So let's talk about where we are today, especially as you described Smith's motivations for getting into politics. Are those still motivating factors within the church? Can you draw that thread?
The church, since the turn of the 20th century and even into the 21st, maintains a position of neutrality. They are not going to endorse candidates. The church is not going to openly campaign in a partisan nature, but it reserves its right to speak out on what it deems moral issues. For instance, a more recent example is when President Trump issued his travel ban against predominantly Muslim countries and also took these really strong stances against immigration of all types. The church actually issued a statement arguing against this type of policy. And remembering a time when Mormons were expelled, and even a time beyond Joseph Smith's leadership, decades after his death, there was a Mormon immigration ban. So there are these moments where the church speaks out on political matters, but usually they deem them as having a moral core to them, and they try to do so in as nonpartisan a way as possible. As for members of the church, they are encouraged by the church to be politically active, but that's just kind of left to their own wills and whims. And we've seen that throughout the 20th century, especially since World War II, Latter-day Saints have been in the United States have been one of the most reliably conservative voting blocs. And I think that still stands today. You can look at the polls and see, yes, they still went for Trump, but they went for Trump less enthusiastically than, say, white evangelical Christians, right? The numbers are way down. Trump never did. He won Utah, but not impressively. But there's division within the American church membership on matters of politics. And I think it's probably epitomized by the two senators from Utah. Mike Lee has gone all in supporting Donald Trump, and he's even compared, infamously, as many see it, he compared Donald Trump to a man named Captain Moroni, who's this heroic figure from the Book of Mormon. Whereas Mitt Romney has spoken out against Donald Trump in many instances and tried to be kind of the voice of conscience in this whole fray. And even past senators such as Jeff Flake, who are themselves Latter-day Saints, have spoken out against this turn in the political right. And so, yeah, I think you still see Latter-day Saints definitely tend to vote more conservatively in the United States. But it's in maybe an interesting crossroads right now, because the way that the Trumpian moment has revealed fractures within the political right. We're also seeing that within the Mormon right, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I just want to shout out Mormon women who in the 1970s become major grassroots activists, especially in Western states, really become the engine of the Christian right in those states, and become reliable activists, reliable voters around what would be called family values issues or social issues. So they are consistent with that idea that there's a moral component to these political issues, and in the 70s and 80s begin to build alliances with white evangelicals and to a certain extent Catholics as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get asked a lot since I've been working on this book and since it's been out. A lot of Latter-day Saints will look to Joseph Smith's religious teachings almost to kind of get a sense of how that should frame their religious beliefs today. And people will ask me about that, about his political thought. It's tricky because his policies are very much a product of the 1840s. And you can't just say, well, Joseph Smith taught this politically, therefore that's going to govern my political ideology. But I think there is an overarching compassion in Joseph Smith's political framework, in his political thought, right? Let's look after marginalized groups. Let's look after groups that are being kind of left behind in democracy or disenfranchised or being abused. And I think there's something to that. They may find a level of compassion and looking out for those on the margins of society.
Well, that's a great place to end it. We really appreciate you coming on. Spencer McBride, the new book is Joseph Smith for President, The Prophet, The Assassins, and the Fight for American Religious Freedom. Other than buying your book, where can people find your work?
Yeah, I'm sometimes active on Twitter. You can find me at Spencer W McBride, and SpencerWMcBride.com is my website.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.